So there is no doubt that if anything has been a challenge over the last year for organizations, it's certainly been about defining and leading with their purpose, and what that means and what that looks like as companies have had to do that sort of in real time. So we have two guests here today who are going to help us take a look at that. And these are two women who are very much steeped in purpose. We have Hannah Peters, who is with WE Communications, and she is the EVP of Corporate Reputation and Brand Purpose. Hello, Hannah.
Hi there.
And we have Molly McKenna from a little company called McDonald's. And Molly is the Senior Director of External Communications there. So welcome, ladies.
Great to be. Thank you.
And just for our audience, we're going to try to save a little bit of time at the end for some questions. So if you'd like to, if anything comes to mind and you want to feed it to your chat room, we will try to get through it at the end. So what we're going to use as a launch pad, and Hannah, you can help us here, is that WE's conducted a global survey on 300 business leaders. Is that correct? Yes. About how their business and they have changed in the last year in regard to purpose. So if you want to start explaining that a little bit and maybe tell us about some of the big takeaways, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Diana. Thank you so much for having me today. So the survey was fielded relatively recently, and we talked with 300 executives, so really senior level executives, C-suite, and very high within organizations, to get a better understanding of how they are leading in real time with purpose. So there were 300 of them that we spoke with across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Singapore. And we really saw, I think, some compelling takeaways about how leaders are showing up in a changed world with impact. And just to hit on, a couple of them, I think the headline is that leaders are evolving to align with a changed world. And a couple of behaviors that really demonstrate that is a willingness to be more introspective, sort of take the time to look within, to understand personal priorities and inclinations, and think about how that can show up as a leader and throughout an organization. Bringing more stakeholders to the table, finding ways to listen, to engage, and to really have a two-way dialogue, even if that requires more vulnerability. And then really just a continued focus on embracing purpose on a global and a local scale. And I think that the lens for that is not just morality, not just about doing the right thing, but also materiality, and a really clear sort of business case for purpose was another thing that showed up in a lot of our data.
Excellent. Is there any particular finding that has surprised you more than anything else?
I think really across the board, one of the things that surprised me, and I mean this in a good way, is really the way that I would say humanity showed up in a lot of the responses that we heard. And I think this comes from really what we've collectively shared as an experience during the pandemic. If you think about the past year, it's been this unprecedented time when we've had this challenge that we've all faced together. And in some ways, it's almost been an equalizer. And I think for CEOs and other leaders, they've had an opportunity to really think about our collective population and the power that they have through their organizations to make a difference and to show up in meaningful ways. So I think it was really, a lot of the answers really showed more of a level of humanity and, again, kind of vulnerability that was interesting and maybe a little counterintuitive if you think about sort of this idea of a hard-nosed, business-driven CEO. And that gave me a lot of hope and optimism through the findings.
Yeah, my next question was going to be the word, introspective and looking within. That's not what we typically think of as right or wrong. It's not what we think of people in power, right? Or they've got to get the business done and everything. And do you see that really as the result of the last year of the pandemic, of them becoming one of us? Or what are some of the things that you see are fueled that sort of look inward?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the pandemic has obviously impacted people in different ways, depending on where they were at the beginning of the pandemic, So I would never want to imply that this concept of being an equalizer is something that means that we've all been impacted equally, because clearly that's not the case. But I think for CEOs, it has given them and other leaders this chance to look within and to have a sort of a moment to recognize what it means to be part of a collective whole. You know, we had 71% of the leaders that we talked to say that articulating their personal core values and elevating their voice is more important for them now than it was a year ago. And we even had more than half talk about sort of an increased realization of their personal fears, of their limitations, and sort of the gaps between their intentions and their actions. So just definitely a level of reflection and introspection that I do believe was really driven by what we've collectively experienced and what they witnessed both within their own organizations and what was happening in the broader world.
I think we're going to have a different vision now of the CEO. Is the CEO going to be the kinder, gentler person than we're used to seeing?
Yeah, I think we might, you know, Diane, I think it's a really important point, but I also think coming back to this idea of business case, this is not just about being altruistic. This is not just about morality. It's about materiality. There's a very clear business case for purpose. You know, companies are taking a stand and acting with purpose, not just because they want to do the right thing or because they're good people, but because, you know, they have responsibilities to their shareholders, they have responsibilities to their employees to maintain their license to operate and to be viable. And there's a lot of evidence that taking an approach that puts purpose at the center drives business viability. You know, we had, if you look at our survey, we had, 90% of the respondents say that purpose leadership is becoming as important for them as financial performance, that they feel market pressure to act with purpose. And, you know, I think we're seeing even more data points in the external context. You know, like Morgan Stanley came out with research just today around ESG investments, you know, stocks and bonds, and how they're performing better, notably better than just the general market. If you look at sort of this greater commitment, that's in the context of sustainability. But there are many, many data points that really show a clear business case for purpose. And I think that that's really important to remember as well, because it's not just about morality, it's also about doing things that are material for the business and that help companies maintain their license to operate and be viable.
Well, so you brought up ESG. Where does purpose and ESG, where do they sort of come into play, being whether they're the same thing or different things? Defining purpose is something that has come out of votes, right? Because there might be organizations that have ESG initiatives embedded in them and all, but purpose is a little vaguer, is it? Or am I wrong?
No, I think it's a good question. And there's a lot of different terminology that people use to talk about purpose. They might, call it citizenship or global impact, the CSR, there's a lot of different terms for what it means. But, I think at the end of the day, what being purpose driven means is just having a broader understanding and investment in the impact that you have as an organization, and being cognizant of the power that organizations have to be a force for good and a force for growth as well. But when it comes to people, when it comes to the environment, to really recognize the power that an organization has to do good in a business context as well as an organization. And I think there's a lot of different activities and commitments that ladder up to them. ESG has become a much more popular term to use now. It originated more in an investor context. For a lot of companies now, it's actually becoming synonymous for CSR, and it really is what, a lot of organizations are sort of gravitating toward. And I think that's because it does bring that business and investor context as well to the table. So I think it all sort of ladders up to purpose, but this concept of ESG, sustainability, social governance, all of that is absolutely a big driver of purpose performance.
And what you're mentioning is that in purpose, organizations are really speaking to all their stakeholders, right?
Yes.
Stakeholder engagement, stakeholder capitalism, it's all becoming a critical component of this. And they're using purpose, I imagine, to speak to all their stakeholders. And I'm wondering how CEOs and organizational leaders are doing that more and more, addressing these concerns and the engagement of their stakeholders.
It's such a good question, and I think we've all heard stakeholder engagement play a bigger role in the conversation we're all having around purpose. Stakeholder capitalism is another phrase, and it's exactly what you just said, which is taking a broader view. It's not just thinking about shareholders as having primacy, but inviting more people to the table. And that's really what we saw in our research, as well. We had more than 2/3 of respondents say that stakeholder engagement is one of the most important leadership behaviors for them in 2021. And I think the most notable parts of the research that speak to what that really looks like in a current context is the who and the how. And the who, loud and clear across the respondents, for many, it's women and it's people of color. And I think those are two groups that we can all acknowledge were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So they need to be at the table. They need to be elevated. They need to be part of the conversations. Employees are a through line for sure. I mean, employees will always be important to the leaders that we're speaking with, but women and people of color were very broadly acknowledged as being critical. And then in terms of the how, I think what we saw, again, it kind of comes back to an increased openness, to a willingness to have tough conversations, to say, tell me more, to sort of leave your defensiveness at the door, to the extent possible, to have open conversations, that really get deeper and get to the root of a problem and how to solve it. And I think we're seeing even CEOs of big companies talk about having those conversations and how they're acting and changing policy as a result in ways that are really, really compelling and show the importance of stakeholder engagement. And it's not going anywhere. I think it's only going to become a more critical part of strategies for leaders.
And stakeholders is going to become broader and broader, right? Stakeholders could be everybody. It's your community, it's your workforce, it's your supply chain. I mean, stakeholders is as broad a term as any, right? And I guess it's defining how you approach each one of them and how you prioritize.
Yes, yeah, I think it's really, really important to have a clear understanding of who your most important stakeholders are and how you can really understand what matters to them. Really have your sort of finger on the pulse of what their priorities are, because their expectations are only getting higher. They're only wanting to see more, and they're only getting sort of more specific in terms of what they're looking for, and more willing to criticize and voice their concerns if they don't see the action and the types of commitments that they want. So I think, again, it comes back to business case. You need to have the opinions of your stakeholders informing the decisions that you're making, or there could be pretty serious business consequences for that.
And there can be competing interests of stakeholders. Stakeholders
Yep.
can have competing interests or other, right?
Absolutely.
So we look a lot at the last year and how it's impacted so much, and in this discussion, purpose and leading with purpose. But we're moving forward in whatever way we're moving forward, right? And so we're all going to continue to have our challenges and all. And so I'm wondering what we can expect to see, or what CEOs, how their leadership may continue to evolve looking forward as they have new challenges.
Yeah, I think we're going to see just more and more demand for impact, for accountability, for transparency. So a lot of what we've been talking about, there's never been a more critical time to embrace purpose-driven leadership. So I think we're going to see more and more companies and leaders showing up in that context. And that's great, but it's also challenging from a communications point of view, because you have to be able to break through, and you have to be able to get traction, and getting that sort of credit and that traction and having your voice heard is really important. And it's going to be more and more difficult to do. So I think how and where you engage is really critical. In our research, one of the areas we heard a lot of our respondents talk about was technology as being a space that they really plan to lean into and invest in. And I think the reason for that is because there's a recognition that technology is a vital means of connection. During the past year, without technology, it's difficult to work, it's difficult to go to school. It's really a big driver of equity. So we saw technology as just one example that showed up in our research as a need that's critical to meet, and that companies can address in different ways that are authentic to them. But again, I think, the coming year and the years to come is just going to require leaders to be more introspective, to have these difficult, important conversations, and probably to take some risks in terms of how and where they show up. But I think in the end, the payoff is really well worth it.
Excellent. So Molly, you have been living purpose the last year for with your company. How has purpose leadership shown up at McDonald's in the last year?
Yeah, thanks so much, Diana. And really interesting research, Hannah. So thank you for sharing. I know it's been really helpful to us as well. When you think about McDonald's, we serve 65 million customers every day around the world, and we are, in pretty much every neighborhood in America. And obviously a lot of communities need us. And this year more than ever, not everyone had the luxury of working from home. And, we had essential workers that, were working long shifts and, needed a hot meal that was easy, on the way home. And so for us, purpose is really to feed and foster the communities that we live in. And so, when COVID hit, our first priority was, we need to stay open and be open for our communities that need us. But of course, we wanted to make sure that we could do it in a safe way, keep our employees safe and our customers safe. So we made over 50 process changes in terms of our operations in our restaurants. And that, allowed us to serve, those hot meals to essential workers. We made changes to things like, our protocol, our restaurants were closed except for our drive-throughs. And so truckers, for example, who were, delivering critical supplies, all over the country, they couldn't go through our drive-through. And so if they couldn't go in the restaurant to get carry out, we, made, different processes for them. So things like that. And, one of the things really proud of is, we were able to give away 12 million free meals to first responders and people in the healthcare industry who were working those long shifts. And so that was our way to say thank you to them. And I think that's, a good example of, our purpose again is to feed and foster our communities. And that was a great way to do that and honor them. Another critical piece for us this year, obviously, as we've talked about, our country's been going through, significant challenges across diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, while that's been always part of our DNA at McDonald's, there's clearly a lot more that this country needs. And so one of the things we've done recently is formed what we're calling a global impact team at McDonald's, and really all to really hold ourselves accountable to making change and having impact on things like sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion. So just last week, in fact, we announced that all of our executive bonuses and pay will all be linked to those diversity goals. So by 2025, for example, we aim to have at least 35% of our executives in leadership roles that are from those historically underrepresented groups. So, those are the types of things that we need to keep doing and making change. And, all kind of ladders back to why we exist, and we wouldn't exist without our great communities. So we definitely have that responsibility to do more.
I have down that you have 36,000 restaurants around the world. Is that correct?
Yes.
Something around 36,000. So I'm wondering, with that kind of scale, how you can boil these things down to your communities. How you can really serve communities when so different, so vast, you're everywhere. Even within one country, it's far and widely different what people need. So how do you operate at that scale and yet being community oriented?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of people think of McDonald's as kind of a big corporate giant, or our brand that's very well known. But a lot of people don't know that our restaurants, 95% of our restaurants, for example, in the US, are owned and operated by local women and men who live in their communities, and they work in their communities. And so, when our founder, Ray Kroc, founded McDonald's in 1955, he said that we have an obligation to give back to those communities that give us so much. And so that's really been part of our DNA. And so our local franchisees, whether you're in, Arkansas or Paris, they are giving back to their communities, in the way of food donations, serving first responders. Right now we have a number of schools that are closed. And so we have franchisees that are providing free breakfast. In times of need right now, everything happening, in Texas with the weather and hurricanes, we're there serving. Just recently, after the Capitol riots, prior to the inauguration, the National Guard was, 24/7 working around the Capitol, and they were looking for a good meal. And so one of our franchisees, we partnered, we brought our big tractor trailer in, and we served free meals, 10,000 meals over that week. So our franchisees, we couldn't do it without them. And they really are what makes McDonald's great, and make McDonald's kind of that local community neighbor that, sometimes people don't think of. So, that's really how we operate kind of locally, but at the global level.
With so many companies out there, and now purpose being kind of at the forefront, what is out there being seen, what communication strategies have you used to cut through all that so McDonald's can be a leader and show its purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean,
I'm sorry, I didn't want to show its purpose, but advance your purpose.
It's a great question. There isn't a communication strategy that's meaningful unless you're actually taking action and taking purposeful action. And, change doesn't happen overnight, and you don't always have to have all the answers or have taken all the steps or it to be perfect, but you need to, share progress along your journey. And I think that's, what makes successful communications and communicating your purpose is, helping to push for that change and then talking about it and acknowledging that, there's always more to do. But sharing your progress along the way. And, that's where I think we've seen things break through more. Last week, our announcement, we had measurement and goals and things around it. And so I think it's really critical that, you have those things to break through.
Right, sort of benchmarks. And what did you learn personally as a communicator over the last year about McDonald's purpose journey? This is a huge company with a long history. What are you coming out? What have you learned in the last year?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think for us, it's being true to who you are, right? Understanding what your purpose is, and being okay with that's your purpose and that's why you exist, and really being true to who you are, I think, and having that authenticity. I think maybe some brands don't do that well enough, and they're trying to think of a purpose, but really not really thinking about kind of what boils down to their purpose and for their brand. So to me, I think knowing who you are, standing proud behind that, and then acknowledging the progress, being humble, and continuing to push for that change.
Well, you mentioned something that I think about often, which is the companies that have to think of their purpose. I mean, organizations often have inherent purposes, right? But is it more about defining them? And this could be for either of you. Defining those purposes, finding those purposes, or creating those purposes?
I think every company has a purpose, right? It's really why you do business, right? So we do business because we serve food, and people come to us because we're a restaurant, right? And that's really why we exist. But to be successful and to do it well, as Hannah, talked about, we need to give back to those communities, and that's what customers expect today. It's no longer an option. It's part of why businesses are successful, exactly as Hannah pointed in her research. So, I think it's finding that purpose, and then finding the right way to flex it and make it authentic, and to talk about it. I'm
sorry, I interrupted you. Please go on.
What's that?
I interrupted you.
No.
Specialty of mine, so please continue.
Yeah, no, I think when McDonald's was formed more than 60 years ago, it was part of our DNA is Ronald McDonald House Charities, and giving back as part of that with our Ronald McDonald Houses around the world, and supporting that. So it can't just be a one time a year fundraiser, or having a campaign about your purpose. It's got to be something that you live and breathe every day. And, that's something we can always do more of. And we're going to continue to show up, and we're going to continue to do that for hopefully another 60 years or more.
And what do you see that future of purpose looking like at McDonald's?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's we will continue to be part of communities, and so we will continue to listen to our communities and try to help them. Hannah talked about technology and accessibility, and I think being such an accessible brand and being in every neighborhood, that is an area that we'll continue to focus in, and helping to give access and provide opportunity and give our communities what they need. So it's we're going to just keep listening and evolving and doing more.
Fabulous. So I have asked my questions because we have a few more minutes. So I want to turn it over to one of our audience members, Judy Cushman. The question is, so what does introspection lead to for the way CEOs determine policy that is more tuned to needs and flexibility for their key stakeholders? I guess that is for you, Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, the first step is sort of this idea of looking within. I think of sort of contemplating what matters to an individual who might be a CEO or a leader. But I think, beyond that, what it looks like is doing something with that. I think, along the lines of what Molly was saying, it's not just saying, it's also doing. So it's not just that realization, but it's putting it into action. So from there, it would really depend on the area. We can use, diversity, equity, and inclusion as maybe an example, because I do think that that's an area that feels really relevant right now. And just to use an example from the past week, PwC was in the news because they talked about being more transparent about their diversity data, like literally opening the doors up and saying, okay, here are all of our statistics around diversity. And their US chairman was quoted in talking about it. And what he said is that transparency may be uncomfortable, but vulnerability and open discussion are critical to leading effectively on diversity. So I think that that's a really actionable example of how he had to be willing to look within the organization, and frankly, probably to look within himself, and that's now leading to policies that are more transparent, that do really open, the door for some of these tough conversations. And I think, a lot of what Molly talked about that's happening at McDonald's is similar. It's just the willingness to move things forward, even if it is a little bit uncomfortable, because that's what's expected and that's what's really needed for the moment that we're in.
Yeah, it's really true. You are pushing into new areas. Discomfort could be part of it. It is really, like you say, making yourself more vulnerable and opening up. So fascinating conversation. I personally love this topic, so I appreciate both of you speaking with us. It's time to wrap this up, and I'm going to hand this back to Arthi, who's going to wrap up our conference this morning.
Yes. Thank you, Diana. And thank you, Molly and Hannah. What a great conversation. And this idea of introspection and leadership, I think, is something that's really fascinating. And I hope that we continue to revisit and have a conversation around. What a great way to end with these two powerful sessions. One about, the new political and media environment, and, how much that's dramatically changed as we've seen, especially over the last 12 months. And then again, what the future of leadership looks like. I think we were once talking about, the empathetic leader of the future, and now we're kind of adding to that the introspective leader of the future. So thank you again, Diana, Molly, and Hannah. And with that, as you all drop off, I will just sort of wrap things up by saying, I know people are eager to get to their lunches or their mid-mornings, depending on where you are in the world. So I won't do a full recap of the day, but I do encourage you all to follow the hashtag ProvokeNA, where you'll find some of the most notable takeaways from throughout the day. I also will just like to thank everyone for joining us for our first fully ever virtual Provoke North America Summit. We had fantastic engagement across the country and probably across the world. I'm sure we had folks tuning in from everywhere. I hope many of you will be tuning into the Innovation Sabre Awards North America, which will be taking place at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. So you West Coasters, get your daytime drinks on. As you all have seen, we literally saw the sun come up in California throughout the course of this day. Once again, I want to thank all of our sponsors who helped make this event happen, and also to our Provoke team. Our editorial and social media team have been sort of hammering away, producing content that you can share with your colleagues, or as I mentioned before, if you missed an event or just want a refresher from some of the great content today, have a look at that. You can look at our social channels, and then the content will be on our site throughout the day, today and tomorrow. We will also be sending out a recap of the day via email, and that will also include links to all of the sessions. So you will have access to the full sessions that will probably come in the next week. And I also want to thank our fabulous events team. I mean, they seamlessly and awesomely, in the true sense of the word, pull off event over an event for us across the world, virtually and live. And I continue to be in awe every single time. So thank you all. I hope to see all of you at this event next year, somehow, some way, depending on what it looks like. Until then, bye for now.